18 seconds. That was the total duration of the decision window. From the moment the lead blocker vehicle appeared to the moment of impact, the driver of the cash-in-transit vehicle had 18 seconds to choose between life and death. Not just for himself, but for his 2 crew members and the $5 million in negotiable bearer bonds secured in the transport vault behind him. Against him was a professionally executed ambush, a kill box prepared by a cartel enforcement squad with military-grade training and equipment. The thesis of this debrief is not to simply recount the events of that morning, but to dissect the critical decision made in that 18-second window. It is an analysis of how human will, forged by thousands of hours of training, can override both established procedure and a technologically superior enemy plan. In the high-risk security sector, we have a saying: "The vehicle is your weapon, your shield, and your coffin." On that day, one man was forced to prove all 3. The operation itself was routine to the point of being dangerously mundane. It was a sweep run, a common logistical task in the financial services industry. The crew's objective was to collect consolidated instruments from several suburban banking institutions and transport them to a central clearinghouse in the city's financial district. This particular route, designated Corridor 7, was run 3 times a week, always between the hours of 6 and 7 in the morning to avoid peak traffic. This predictability, a necessary component of logistical efficiency, was also its primary strategic vulnerability. An enemy with even basic surveillance capabilities could establish a reliable pattern of movement, and in this case, the enemy had far more than basic capabilities. The vehicle was a purpose-built armored transport, manufactured by a specialized security vehicle company known for its robust designs. It was based on a heavy-duty commercial truck chassis, up-armored to a B6 ballistic protection level. This rating certifies its ability to withstand multiple impacts from high-powered rifle rounds up to 7.62 by 51 mm NATO. The body was constructed from hardened ballistic steel, and the windows were a multi-layer composite of polycarbonate and ballistic glass, nearly 3 inches thick. At all junctures, doors, windows, and firing ports, the armor employed an overlap system, designed to prevent penetration at the seams, which are traditional weak points. The vehicle weighed approximately 9 tons, its momentum a significant tactical asset. Its tires were run flats, capable of sustaining multiple punctures and continuing for at least 30 miles at reduced speed. It was, by all metrics, a mobile fortress. But every fortress has a flaw. The B6 rating, while impressive, does not guarantee invulnerability. It is a rating of resistance, not immunity. Sustained, concentrated fire on a single point can eventually defeat the armor. More critically, the armor's primary defense mechanism against kinetic energy is to absorb and delaminate, which creates a dangerous secondary effect inside the cabin known as spalling. When a projectile strikes the exterior, it may not penetrate, but the force can cause fragments of the interior armor layer, tiny, superheated shards of steel and composite material, to break off and fly into the cabin at high velocity. Spalling is the reason crews wear ballistic vests and helmets even inside a B6-rated vehicle. The shield can wound you, even as it saves you. The crew consisted of 3 individuals, each with a specific role dictated by standard operating procedure. In the passenger seat was the communications and navigation guard. His job was to manage the encrypted radio link to the central dispatch, monitor the GPS tracking, and serve as a second set of eyes for the driver. In the rear compartment, separated from the cabin by an armored bulkhead, was the cargo guard. He was the last line of defense for the asset, a lone sentinel in a windowless steel box with control over the vault's final locking mechanisms. His role is inherently static, a passive defense position. Then there was the driver. He was a 48-year-old veteran of the industry with over 20 years of experience, 15 of them in the high-threat cash-in-transit sector. His logbook showed more than 30,000 hours behind the wheel of an armored vehicle. He was not a law enforcement officer or a soldier. He was a professional driver, a specialist whose entire career was the study of defensive and evasive driving under the most extreme conditions imaginable. His training record was extensive, including advanced courses in ambush recognition, vehicle dynamics under fire, and counter-surveillance techniques. His psychological profile noted a low resting heart rate, an exceptionally calm demeanor under simulated stress, and a cognitive style that favored rapid, heuristic decision-making. He was, in short, the single most valuable component of the entire security system, more valuable than the B6 armor, the run-flat tires, or the encrypted communications. He was the human element, the processor that all the hardware was built to protect. The success of any security operation rests on a pyramid of dependencies. The base of that pyramid is intelligence. On this day, the base of the pyramid had been pulverized. Weeks after the incident, a forensic audit of the client corporation's internal communications revealed a catastrophic data breach. A major trafficking organization, seeking to diversify its revenue streams into high-value financial instruments, had compromised the email server of a mid-level logistics coordinator. For 6 months, they had a real-time feed of route schedules, cargo manifests, and vehicle specifications. They knew the what, the where, and the when. The ambush was not a crime of opportunity. It was a pre-planned, intelligence-driven military operation executed by a criminal enterprise. The armored truck crew was driving into a kill zone that had been designed specifically for them, using their own operational data as the blueprint. The chosen location for the ambush was a masterful piece of tactical geography. It was a 400-meter stretch of 4-lane road, bordered on one side by a steep wooded embankment and on the other by a concrete sound barrier for a suburban housing development. It was a natural channel, a man-made canyon that limited lateral movement. Critically, it was located precisely 2.2 miles from the nearest police station, which, according to the attacker's own surveillance data, translated to a minimum response time of 4 to 6 minutes. The attackers did not need hours. They planned to conclude the entire operation in under 180 seconds. The time was 6:47 in the morning. The road was nearly empty. Within 90 seconds, that stretch of asphalt would transform into a kill zone, an ambush envelope meticulously designed to neutralize the armored vehicle and its crew. The attacking force was comprised of at least 8 individuals, a number later confirmed by forensic evidence and eyewitness accounts from a distance. Their equipment and tactics indicated a level of sophistication far beyond that of common criminals. They carried 5.56 millimeter carbines, standard for entry teams, but also at least one 7.62 millimeter light machine gun, a weapon designed for sustained, suppressive fire capable of degrading vehicle armor. They wore uniform black fatigues, body armor, and balaclavas. Their movements were coordinated, economical, and professional. Post-incident analysis by federal law enforcement agencies strongly suggested that the core of the team was composed of former special operations soldiers from a foreign military, now working as contractors for the cartel. These were not thugs. They were professional adversaries. Their plan was a classic 3-stage vehicle ambush. The first stage was isolation. A stolen panel van, designated the blocker vehicle, would pull out from a side street and stop, feigning engine trouble, completely obstructing the 2 lanes of travel. This would force the target vehicle to a halt. The second stage was fixation. As the target vehicle stopped, a second vehicle, a heavy pickup truck, would move in from behind, closing the trap and preventing any attempt to reverse out of the kill zone. Simultaneously, shooters positioned on the wooded embankment would open fire. The goal of this initial volley was not necessarily to penetrate the cabin, but to achieve psychological and mechanical disruption, shattering the windshield to obscure vision, shredding the front tires, and targeting the engine block. The third and final stage was assault. Under the cover of overwhelming suppressive fire from the machine gun, an assault team would advance on the now stationary vehicle, place a high-yield explosive breaching charge on the crew door, and neutralize the occupants. The entire plan was predicated on a single, critical assumption. It was an assumption born of intellectual arrogance and a deep study of standard operating procedures for the cash-in-transit industry. They assumed compliance. They knew that the SOP for an unexpected obstruction is to stop at a safe distance, assess the situation, and attempt to reverse away from the potential threat. Standard operating procedure dictated that the driver should avoid confrontation, that the vehicle's armor was a shield to be used defensively, a shell to hide inside while calling for backup. The attacker's plan was not designed to defeat an armored truck. It was designed to defeat a security guard following a rule book. This was their fatal flaw. They had planned for the procedure, but they had not planned for the man. At 6:47 and 3 seconds, the panel van pulled out from the side street 150 meters ahead. It moved slowly, erratically, then came to a complete stop, angled across both lanes. A man got out, opened the hood, and waved his hands in a universal gesture of frustration. It was a perfect piece of theater. The passenger guard, the comms officer, reacted as expected. He reported later that he immediately recognized it as a potential threat, keyed his microphone, and began to state the protocol. "Driver, halt. Potential blockade ahead. Advise we reverse." This is the moment. This is where the physical event becomes a psychological case study. In this instant, the driver's mind entered what is known in tactical circles as the OODA loop, a concept developed by military strategist John Boyd. Observe, orient, decide, act. It is a cognitive cycle of decision-making under pressure. The faster and more accurately an individual can cycle through the loop, the greater their advantage over an adversary. Observe. The driver saw the van. He saw the man. But he also saw what the passenger guard did not. He saw the lack of cross-traffic on a road that, even at this hour, should have had some. He saw the unnatural stillness on the wooded embankment. His thousands of hours of experience had created a deep, subconscious baseline for normalcy on the road. This scene deviated from that baseline in a dozen subtle ways. He observed a fiction. Orient. This is the most critical phase of the loop. It is where observation is filtered through experience, training, and context. The passenger guard oriented to the visible threat. The van. He matched it to his training manual, which said stop. The driver oriented to the invisible threat, the ambush he could not yet see but could feel. His orientation was not based on a single data point, but on a holistic, intuitive synthesis of the entire environment. He understood that the van was not the threat, it was the lure. The real threat was the space between his vehicle and that van, the kill zone. He oriented to the fact that stopping would mean surrendering the vehicle's single greatest tactical advantage, its momentum. Static defense is death. Decide, two options presented themselves, each with catastrophic potential. Option A was the standard operating procedure. Stop the vehicle. Place it in reverse. Inform dispatch. This was the safe, defensible, and procedurally correct choice. It was also, the driver instantly concluded, a death sentence. It would cede the initiative entirely to the attackers. They would be stationary targets in a box, waiting for a breaching charge. Option B was the unthinkable. To override the SOP, ignore the passenger guard and accelerate directly into the blockade. To use the 9-ton vehicle not as a shield, but as a battering ram. It was a choice that risked a high-speed collision, potential vehicle rollover, and severe injury. But it was the only choice that seized the initiative. It was the only choice that broke the attacker's script. Act. At 6:47 and 21 seconds, 18 seconds after the van first appeared, the driver's foot stomped down on the accelerator. The passenger guard reported later that he shouted in protest, thinking the driver had panicked. But it was not panic. It was the purest form of clarity. The massive diesel engine roared, and the 9-ton vehicle surged forward. The attackers were caught completely off guard. Their plan relied on a compliant halt, followed by a controlled, methodical assault. The driver's decision to accelerate blew a hole through their OODA loop. For a critical few seconds, they were forced to reorient. The shooter on the embankment, who was supposed to begin a disciplined volley on a stationary target, instead fired hastily. At 6:47 and 24 seconds, the first rounds impacted the armored truck. A spray of 5.56mm rounds stitched across the front of the vehicle. Several struck the ballistic glass of the windshield, which starred and crazed into a spiderweb of opaque fractures, but did not fail. The driver was now driving blind, navigating by memory and the sliver of visibility remaining at the very edges of the glass. 3 seconds later, at 6:47 and 27 seconds, the heavier 7.62mm machine gun opened up. The sound inside the cabin was deafening, a percussive roar of metal on metal. The impacts felt like sledgehammer blows. This was the suppressive fire, designed to pin the crew down, to induce terror, to degrade their will to fight. It was at this moment that the spalling began. Tiny, razor-sharp fragments of the interior armor coating blasted into the cabin. The driver sustained multiple lacerations to his face and hands. The passenger guard, struck in the shoulder, felt a sharp, burning pain. The vehicle was attacking them from the inside. But it was still moving. The attacker's assault team, which had begun to move from cover to approach the vehicle, was now forced to scramble back. Their target was not stopping, it was accelerating. It was coming right at them. At 6:47 and 31 seconds, 28 seconds into the event, the armored truck, traveling at approximately 50 miles per hour, struck the panel van. The physics of the collision were brutally simple. The 9-ton, purpose-built battering ram hit the 2-ton, hollow-bodied van just forward of its center axis. The impact was catastrophic for the blocker vehicle. It was lifted, twisted, and thrown aside like a toy, its chassis folding around the armored truck's reinforced bumper. The driver of the truck experienced a violent deceleration, and his head struck the steering wheel despite his harness, but he never lost control. The force of the impact was channeled through the truck's heavy-duty frame, just as it was designed to do. The driver did not stop. He kept his foot on the accelerator, pushing through the mangled wreckage of the van. The screech of tortured metal was indescribable. For a moment, the two vehicles were locked together, but the sheer power of the truck's engine won out. It tore itself free from the debris field it had created and continued down the road. The kill zone had been breached. The escape was not clean. The pickup truck that was meant to block their rear now found its path obstructed by the wreckage of its own side's blocker vehicle. The attackers' perfectly laid trap had become their own obstacle. They fired a few parting shots at the retreating truck, but the range was increasing with every second. The engagement, from first shot to clearing the kill zone, had lasted less than 45 seconds. In that time, forensic analysis later determined that over 300 rounds had been fired at the vehicle. 78 rounds had impacted. The majority were 5.56mm, but at least 20 were the heavier 7.62mm rounds from the machine gun. Not a single round had achieved full penetration of the crew cabin. The driver continued for another 2 miles, the truck's engine sputtering and leaking fluids, the front tires, though run flats, completely shredded and hammering against the pavement. He finally brought the vehicle to a halt in the parking lot of a brightly lit, 24-hour convenience store, a calculated move to a public space covered by surveillance cameras. He keyed his own mic, his voice recorded on the dispatch logs as preternaturally calm. He stated his location, reported contact, and requested medical assistance for his crew. The $5 million in the back was completely secure. The aftermath tells a story of contrasts. The armored vehicle was a functional write-off. Its engine block was cracked from at least 2 7.62 millimeter impacts. Its radiator was destroyed. The entire front fascia was a mangled wreck from the collision. Every single body panel on the front and left side was pocked and deformed by gunfire. The ballistic windshield was a total loss, a milky, opaque ruin. Inside, the cabin was a scene of controlled chaos, littered with shattered glass, bits of wiring, and the sharp, metallic dust of spalling. Yet, it had performed its primary function. It had shielded its occupants from lethal force. The crew's injuries were non-life-threatening. The passenger guard had sustained a deep laceration and muscle bruising in his shoulder from a particularly large piece of spalling. The driver had multiple cuts on his hands and face and a mild concussion from striking the steering wheel. The cargo guard in the rear was unharmed, having only been thrown about by the violence of the collision and the barrage of impacts. They had survived an event that, by all statistical measures, should have been fatal. The outcome for the antagonists was markedly different. Their return on investment was zero. The intelligence gathered from the scene, shell casings, abandoned equipment, and DNA from a blood trail left by one of the wounded attackers, led to a series of raids by federal authorities over the next several months. The entire cartel cell was eventually dismantled. Their meticulous planning had resulted in a spectacular, unmitigated failure. They had lost men, equipment, and their operational security, all for nothing. So, what are the lessons to be drawn from this incident? A tactical analysis reveals several critical takeaways. The synthesis of the event shows a complex interplay between technology, procedure, and human psychology. The technology, the B6 armor and run-flat tires, worked. It absorbed the kinetic energy and bought the crew the most precious commodity in any fight: time. But technology alone would not have saved them. Had the driver followed procedure, the technology would have only served to prolong their deaths, turning their shield into a coffin while they waited for a breaching charge to detonate. The institutional security, the procedural framework, failed completely. The intelligence failure at the corporate level was the original sin that set the entire catastrophe in motion. Furthermore, the standard operating procedure for the crew was fundamentally flawed, as it was predictable. It played directly into the hands of a sophisticated adversary who had done their homework. The rulebook was a liability. This brings us to the ultimate decisive factor, the human element. The driver's actions demonstrate the absolute supremacy of trained, adaptive decision-making over rigid protocol. His 20 years of experience were not just a line on a resume. They were a deeply ingrained database of sensory information and tactical knowledge. That database allowed him to perform the OODA loop faster and more accurately than his opponents, and to make a choice that was, by the standards of his profession, heretical. He chose to transform a defensive asset into an offensive weapon. He understood the unwritten rule. The fight goes to those who understand that the only way out of the kill zone is through it. From this incident, we can distill 4 core lessons. First, Intelligent security is the foundation of all physical security. A breach in the digital world can and will lead to catastrophic failure in the physical world. The most advanced armor is useless if the enemy knows your route, your destination, and your schedule. The first line of defense is not steel, it is data integrity. Second, static defense is death. This is a universal principle in conflict, from armored warfare to corporate security. The moment a mobile asset becomes stationary in a hostile environment, it surrenders the initiative and begins to die. An armored vehicle's momentum is as much a part of its defensive system as its ballistic steel. The attacker's plan was not just to stop the truck, it was to stop its ability to act. The driver's refusal to become static was the linchpin of his survival. Third, equipment buys time, but training determines outcomes. The B6 armor absorbed hundreds of rounds, giving the driver the seconds he needed to act. The run-flat tires allowed him to escape the kill zone even after they were destroyed. But this time would have been meaningless if his training had not prepared him to use it decisively. The technology was a necessary, but not sufficient, condition for success. It was the driver's deep well of training that allowed him to make the correct, albeit terrifying, decision. It proves that the most sophisticated hardware is only as effective as the software of the human mind operating it. Fourth, and finally, methodology must evolve to match the sophistication of the threat. This incident was a clear signal that the nature of cash-in-transit attacks was evolving. The adversary was no longer a common smash-and-grab crew. They were tactical professionals employing military strategies. Therefore, security protocols cannot remain static. They must become more dynamic, less predictable. Training must be updated to include unconventional scenarios and empower operators to make command decisions that deviate from the standard rulebook when circumstances warrant. We must train for the enemy we have, not the enemy we wish we had. Revisiting the attacker's failure, their core mistake was a failure of imagination. They had perfect intelligence on the hardware and the procedures. They had a tactically sound plan to defeat both. What they lacked was intelligence on the human spirit. Their calculations were built around a compliant variable, a person who would behave as the manual dictated. They could not conceive of a driver who, when faced with overwhelming force, would choose to accelerate into the heart of it. They failed to account for the psychological power of a single individual who refused to be a victim, who refused to be static, and who had been trained to the point where his vehicle was no longer just a truck, but an extension of his own indomitable will. In the final analysis, the event was decided by what happened in the driver's mind during that 18-second window. It was decided by a man who had spent 30,000 hours on the road, not just driving, but thinking, observing, and learning. He had built a bridge in his mind, a neural pathway between a threat stimulus and an unconventional aggressive response. Standard procedure told him to stop. Instinct and a lifetime of experience told him that stopping was surrender. The technology performed as designed. The procedures failed as designed. But the man, the seasoned professional, transcended both. He demonstrated that in the final crucible of combat, when plans have failed and technology is being pushed to its breaking point, the outcome rests on the decision of the human being in the hot seat. It rests on their courage, their training, and their willingness to drive through the fire. We call that critical moment of psychological transition, that instant where years of repetitive training and mental conditioning override the primal instinct to flee or freeze. The mental bridge. It is the psychological crossing point where training becomes action, where conscious thought gives way to ingrained, immediate response. The driver didn't have time to weigh the pros and cons. He had already done that 1,000 times in simulations and in his own mind. When the moment came, he simply walked across the bridge he had already built. The fight goes to those who understand that the only way out of the kill zone is through it. End of debrief.